Welcome to the Data Masterclass Podcast, where data leaders share their unique stories. In this episode today, we talked with Siddharth Rajagopal, who is Chief Architect at Informatica, about the topic, Data as the Fourth Pillar. Let's welcome your host, Aleksejs Plotnikovs.
Hello, my dear data friends. So this time we again in a podcast, and we have today a very interesting guest for our interview. And we'll be talking several things, just to give a little bit of a glimpse. We will be talking, of course, data, but we will talk data in a very interesting perspective, which is also a new way for us to position, the maturity of data, the need for data in the enterprises. And so we have a very special guest today. So Sid, welcome to our podcast, and please introduce yourself.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me, Aleksejs. Really happy to be here. So my name is Siddharth Rajagopal. I'm the author, first of all, of the book called Data as the Fourth Pillar. You probably see it in my background here. But in my day job, I also work as the chief architect at Informatica. Informatica, as you probably know, is a data management enterprise company for 30 plus years. And in that, I work as part of the CTO organization. What that basically means is I primarily work with our strategic customers, so get to work in a lot of big enterprises to help build their data strategy, build their data architectures, and also from that feedback a little bit how our innovation should look like. Right? So it's a great role, and I'm very happy to be part of it.
Super interesting. That's why your perspective is also so different. We usually talk to the data leaders who runs the business in their organization, and they're happy to explain their journey and like what they have done and so on, but they rarely see across, right? And so what I'm super fascinated with your role as a CTO nowadays, when technology so much matters for data and AI. So kind of coming back a little bit to your day-to-day job, you said you see a lot of different companies introducing data strategies, introducing architecture, introducing technology. I know you as a great speaker, by the way, of a Data Masterclass events, right? So this is something which I forgot to mention. Yeah. But as you observe, this situation with data nowadays, what are the key things you see across the enterprises?
Yeah, it's a great point. There's so many perspectives, but let me start from the top. So at one hand, I see, especially with the advent of AI, I think data leaders and C-suite in general is seeing the importance of data. So that is a good positive spin to this. But still, I see the leaders not sure how to go about it. So everyone is recognizing the importance of data, but there's not a clear perspective how to go forward with it. And in one hand, I think there are a couple of things to think of here, right? A lot of focus is on the what I call the supply side of data. So when I say supply side of data, it's everything to do with technology, everything to do with data products, everything to do with metadata, whatever it is, but everything to deliver a particular business need. But I still feel that connection is still not formed to the level of maturity. And coming back to that maturity topic, from a demand management side of things. So, if you look at traditional products, for example, there's a lot of focus on sales and marketing and demand management, right? I feel still from a data side of things, I'm not saying in every enterprise, especially in enterprises where the data leaders come from the business, it's a much better situation. But still, there are a lot of situations where the demand is not very clear, and we are building a lot of great supply, but then hoping people will come to the supply with some demand, which not sure if that's the right way to go.
Okay, and so if we tap into this maturity thing, so you've mentioned this data maturity, I've mentioned this data maturity. I saw people applying different meanings to this. So some companies says that the data maturity is, basically like how much they have invested into their technology, into qualifying and quantifying like everything they do with data, or like how many of those governance initiative landed, and things like this, which speaks a lot to what you mentioned as a supply side, right? So we have a lot of toolage, we have a lot of different frameworks and so on.
Right.
On the other hand, when I look back on my own experience with data, and I wouldn't say that the company was mature from this perspective, but where it was very mature, it from the perspective, how can you drive the business with data? And so I think this is what you've mentioning also from the maturity perspective, kind of more in that space where we can identify what is important for the company, for the growth, for the true business success. And then we're able continuously, systematically, smoothly translate this into what it means for data.
Oh, exactly that. And here, I think there's a bit of a trend which I have seen, at least in my day-to-day role at Informatica, is that especially with the data leaders, it's still uh, sometimes difficult to quantify the business ROI, right? So it's always, you make an investment, whether it's from a supply side, whatever it is, but then you're constantly trying to retrofit. Maybe you've made the investment from technology standpoint, from a people standpoint, and then you're trying to retrofit how that could be, justifying from a business perspective. Ideally, the situation we want to see, and some enterprises are doing it, is when you start from your business value mapping. Like, for example, when most enterprises go through a huge business transformation, like opening up a new plant, for example, or if you're opening up a completely new geography or a completely new product line. Now, I'm more thinking manufacturing and retail in this example, but get the drift. In those cases, you always do a business value map, and you typically have like a specific strategy team. Sometimes you get a consulting, enterprise come in and do a detailed study of, what are all the key business processes that needs to be embodied for that particular transformation. What kind of people we need, sometimes even what kind of technology we need. Unfortunately, data is always thought of as an afterthought after this. So for example, you say, "Oh, I'll set up a new ERP system, and in that there will be some kind of, let's say, order to cash process," just to give an example, and the data will come as a topic, as a subtopic of either the order to cash or the ERP system, rather than looking at this whole strategic initiative and figuring out, hey, what are the common threads of data we need across different processes, across different technologies, not just one single application. That will make demand much more easier to fulfill with supply. Then you probably also know what kind of supply you need, whether you are over investing or under investing with your supply strategy, right? So that is kind of what I think is at a scale still missing. I'm not saying it's not happening at all, but at a large enterprise scale, with the if you think of every enterprise, I would say at this point, 9 out of 10 boards are talking about AI, but 9 out of 10 boards are not talking about data in the way we are discussing.
So how do you get them to talk about that? Exactly in this way how we discussed, to see it as an end-to-end enabler. Like sometimes I was comparing this with the financial approaches in a company. Like when you look in a good financial discipline in a company or talk to CFO, the person would know like in and out everything, like from supply chain to the spends to the marketing spend to like everything, can be able to connect and plan with this. Right. And then we look on your example with data. I absolutely agree. People don't see it holistically, within the organization, like as a horizontal kind of a flow and drive, for the processes. So how do you get them to think about this?
Yeah, it's a great point, and exactly. I mean, we are hitting the nail on the head here a little bit, and this is where it's beyond what we are talking about from a pure data standpoint. It's also how the operating model of the enterprise is set up. What I mean by that is, especially in large enterprises, a lot of the data teams are primarily, again, set up from a supply standpoint. And I come myself from a tech background, right? So I'm kind of hitting myself on the head when I say this. But what I mean is the data team should have varied layers of skills. Of course, I feel the data team needs to be strongly business oriented, as we've already established. They need to, show that they bring something to the table beyond talking about the supply and a technology standpoint. Secondly, you also require, I think, as you hit the nail on the head, perhaps we need also some financial experts in the data teams, right? So who could kind of bring those best practices from a finance standpoint, but then augment it from a from a data standpoint, right? I think we need these different kind of skills within the data organization than purely the data engineers or the data scientists alone, which will be of course needed as well. But I feel this mix is probably needed. Along with that, the other important question is the role of the data leader, right? Whether we call him or her the chief data officer or data lead, or the title is, I think, secondary. What is important is what is the incentive model for that role, right? First of all, who is defining the job description for this? Is this being defined from an IT perspective, for instance? A CIO is defining the job title, which potentially can have the some of the side effects that we've talked about in terms of it being very cost driven, trying to be technology oriented. But secondly, what is the incentive model, as I said? So how is this data leader going to be incentivized? Is it based on some big cost saving exercise, some big technology transformation, or is it really to measure what is the value from a overall enterprise value standpoint? I think all that requires to be reimagined, I would say, at this point for all of this what we are discussing to work.
So good. But here I have a question. How did you usually get engaged into the company? Like when your role, from CTO of Informatica is being called out, like who is calling for your involvement into the company?
Yeah, great question. And this is where I think I've been very fortunate that it's been a variety of roles that I'm speaking to, depending on the enterprise we're working with, depending on their maturity, and of course, depending on their usage of Informatica as a result, and at that maturity journey with that as well. But in that sense, if you think of the model, we've got many customers where we are strategically a data management foundation from a data office standpoint, in which case I probably talk to the chief architect or the chief data officer or the data leads. But in several customers, we are also you know uh, embedded into particular business domains, especially as we know with the advent of the data mesh concept and a decentralized or federated model. uh, we are also brought in a lot to help the maturity of certain business domains on behalf of a data office. In which case, the discussion wouldn't go far if you just go in and start talking about technology. You need to really help them understand how they can realize their business pain points, and the concept of data products or data management comes as a guide towards that rather than this. So that is where I think I got a lot of the perspectives, but also a lot of the challenges that I saw on the ground with some of these customers.
But you say then that they basically calling you for, let's say, this data management, key principles, key architecture within federated environment, things like this. And I think this is very valuable, to really have that CTO perspective on architecture in a big company. And then you come and you say, hey guys, this is not about the technology, but what's your motivation as a data leader, right? Do you have the right skills in your team? Are you talking to business? Now, I'm trying to imagine what we just talked, in practice, how does this work for people? Like, are they getting in shock, or are they saying like, hey, hold on, please consult me on a data mesh, right? And don't limit my team design, or what happens?
You're very right, but it's also with a lot of these customers, I've had the fortune of working with some great data leaders over a period of time. So it's not probably a first kind of discussion conversation, but over time we see these patterns. And what we also realized is they are not coming to me purely only for the Informatica experience, because we have great people who can do that on a day-to-day basis. But they're also wanting to learn what are the failures from some of the other customers similar to them, right? And a lot of that discussion is beyond technology, as you know, right? So because we might have the greatest technology with great AI functions and capabilities, but if some of the discussions we are talking about are not cracked, I mean, that's kind of like a loss for both parties. Even the Informatica side of the coin, we wouldn't get much adoption. But from that data leader or the business leader perspective, they would not be successful in an investment they have made. In often terms, these are multi-million-dollar investments. So I think the enormity of that is beyond just what we can help from a pure for features and functions, or a pure data mesh or architecture perspective. Also, I think the data mesh principles I don't know what's your thought on it, Alex. I love the principles and the concepts that Jamak brought in, and I actually feel it's much more operating model discussion than a technology discussion. I mean, technology is probably the secondary part to this conversation, and how you operate it and how you got the right setup to scale is probably more important to data mesh succeeding than a particular piece of technology.
No, I absolutely with you here. So I don't see this as the technology, and I was very privileged at my time at Microsoft. But we have been one of the first companies who actually implemented this without even knowing of what Zhamak Dehghani is doing, and we reconnected afterwards at the time when she published the first article. And I think, I saw this really as this kind of a really federation of the effort, and kind of keeping like what's important for the central roles versus enabling, the domains to go faster with their needs. And I kind of see today that, this data mesh have almost like a second brief, that kind of second wave, because of the
Right.
AI efforts, right? So a lot of people, when they were investing in data before, and this was already, as you say, multi-million investments, but now when companies investing into AI, they also start to see like, okay, there are certain things which you want to keep central because they are very costly, and you want to have some similarity, you want to have some scalability. But also, you want to have this AI actually on the edge. You want to see it as a business driver. This involves domain, this involves business units who knows best what to do with this AI capability. And so you have to kind of keep that federation and this aspect of like central efforts, well orchestrated, and technology selection and so on. But you also enable a lot of that, AI mesh, or this AI kind of scalability across the enterprise. So I think it's very demanded, kind of reburn almost like into another need for AI nowadays.
Absolutely agree. And I think in the concept of, or the setup of AI also, we see the concept of AI products coming up as a common term, right? Because you could build a lot of AI on top of data products as well. And this is again where the concept of mesh and reusability, certain parts being centralized, certain parts being federated, uh, is I think critical. And then also from a it all eventually comes back also from a cost perspective, because we see a lot of these, if you go completely federated or decentralized, a lot of the heavy work or heavy lifting is being redone. So that also becomes a good positioning for a central team to offer certain capabilities as a service, for instance. That's again a model we see.
Can you maybe share some example? I mean, you've mentioned already that a lot of these conversations which happens with the data leaders, you bring those use cases, you bring those different experience from the customers, which, worked well. And I was wondering, like, if there is, one or two examples you can also bring through, like what it feels like when you sharing in a company who wants to accelerate their data and AI journey. And so they're calling for you, and you're coming, and of course you talking, always important technical and non-technical things. But to make them believe, it's good to kind of bounce in some real life example, like, hey guys, do like this and you will succeed. So do you have those type of, universal examples which really works well, for the company management and data management?
Sure. Let me mention a couple of examples. I'll not mention the customer names, but I'll just mention the pain points and the stories. One is a huge pharma customer. And what we found is, in pharma, when you're trying to build such a data products landscape, you have typically a big unit, which is typically our R&D unit, which typically works on their own, right? Because R&D is a heavily funded part of the organization. They like to operate in a, I don't want to call it a silo, but at least operate on their own a little bit, but then independently. But then a lot of things that comes out of that is interlinked to the downstream, for example, distribution and the supply chain, and the actual customer experience at the end when they are, for example, procuring these drugs from a retail outlet. Right? What we found out, for example, in data products, one very simple problem we found out is a lot of these pharma enterprises were creating a kind of a front end portal, right, where you can go ahead and build data products and you can find what they're using. When they started doing this, they found out that actually they are all buying third-party data for this some kind of say marketing analysis, or they're buying third-party data from different suppliers, etc. And they were actually procuring this individually because they didn't know what the other divisions were doing. So they ended up spending. Imagine, I'm just making a number up. Imagine each of this data set cost 100,000 euro. If five of them within the same company were starting to buy the same things because they didn't know each other's were using. This was a bit of a quick fix because you can just create a front end portal and start, especially for these kind of external data that you're procuring. You start providing an information of what you have, and that can be a very easy way to know that okay, the other department has this, so you can easily use that than trying to purchase, and you can build some kind of cross charging mechanism, right? So this is an example of let's say a sweet spot where you can find a pain point quickly. But in the same pharma customer, what happened after a while, coming back to that R&D problem, the end product, for example, were having a lot of recalls because there were some, let's say, some issues in a particular batch. But a recall is not as easy as it sounds. A recall needs to traverse through multiple departments to find the root cause, and often you have to also go back to R&D and a simple thing like product codes and item codes. So the end product may be called, let's say, this is not the exact customer, but let's say the end product is selling paracetamol, and paracetamol may have a product code depending on the type of paracetamol you're buying. However, when you go back and trace back to all the source ingredients, there is no easy track and trace method with today because all of these functions are operating their business processes in silo and they have their individual item codes and product codes. So this is a key important area where data is traversing through multiple different departments. You almost need a kind of a reference data mapping to map different kind of product codes, different departments and different items, so that when a particular batch requires a recall, you are able to use technology to kind of traverse this backwards. But this is easy for you and me to understand. But if you go and tell this to, let's say, just the R&D function, they will say, what is the incentive for us to share all these codes or some of this confidential information? They will say, oh, this is against some regulatory law that may be there in the healthcare or pharma sector, right? So this is again where I think a buy-in requires from the data office to explain the value, what kind of information they may get back. For example, some of this downstream information may help them better do the next set of products to be developed or clinical trials to be performed better, right? But that is not something which will come just if you are a tech data leader. You may just go in and say, oh, I will give you a data products, and maybe there is something you will find in this gold, but we don't know what it is. It's kind of figure it out for yourself. What we've seen in these situations, the buy-in only comes from one or two units where business is still more innovative, but it doesn't get buy-in from across the business units, especially those business units like the R&D, which is heavily funded or operating independently kind of situation.
I see, and I see this kind of your role of facilitator. Like, hey, I will facilitate the connections between different business units so that you guys finally start to talk together.
Exactly. And also calling out in that sense the compounded value of data, right? So because our value is best reached when we find certain data, whatever we call it, data products or data sets or even metadata, right? In the context of AI, semantic context is critical. If we find out that that same thing is required by 3, 4, 5 different business units and hopefully in each different personas, that makes the compounding model much easier because then from a supply side of things, you invested once, but then from a demand side of things, there's 5, 6 different demand streams coming in, which makes all parties happy. Informatica is happy because you are using their technology. The central data team is happy because the investment they have made from a Informatica or from an overall standpoint is easily justifiable because if you break that link, 5 or 6 different domains are going to shout, and then that makes the CDO or the data leader's role much easier. And then the business units are happy because they will find a lot of things available or slightly extendable, but they don't have to start from scratch to build uh, data for their particular use.
Nirvana marketplace.
Yes.
Okay, cool. No, I like this example actually. It's really this kind of sweet spot of how it should work. So, next question from my side. So, I'm imagining you doing this for a while, and you explaining this, and you kind of explaining what feels obvious for you to the people who doesn't realize, this is obvious things they should do. So you're learning these practices, you're collecting those practices, you have more and more. You can quickly diagnose, by entering in an organization and talking for, 30 minutes, you already see like the picture, like what's going on there. Right? So at some point of time, I guess this idea of the book comes in.
Yeah. I think there was a couple of defining aha moments on this, and also with my co-author, by the way. So it's not just an individual effort. So my co-author and me, as well as the CDO of Audi production, we all came together. But I think the realization came where I think we were all finding this pattern we are discussing now, Aleksejs, where we found, especially with the advent of Gen AI, we saw even more this becoming a scaled issue. And then we also started getting a lot of questions on specifically technology. But then we felt, and these were coming for really high level C-suite leaders, and then we felt, okay, but then we might get into the same trap we've been having for the last decade or 2 decades with data. So that was more the goal of writing the book was really to penetrate beyond the typical data leaders. Of course, I think there's would be a lot of value for data leaders as well, but the message is more really, that's why we called it data as the fourth pillar, that treat data the same way as you treat your current operating model from a people, process, and technology standpoint, but also positioning data in this layer, because the other realization we kept having was data and technology is still working well, but data and process, meaning how do you apply a reusable process within the data landscape? For example, how to set up from a producer and a consumer standpoint a data product or a data mesh landscape, but also from a people standpoint, as we just discussed, it's not just the data engineer and the data scientist. What kind of people we require, and why it's so important to have different characteristics in the data team. So all this comes together, that four pillars that we talk about: people, process, tech, and data. And that was the kind of seed of the book. So yeah, it happened a couple of years ago like this.
So I think all of us working in this, data and technology, of course, we collect, as we say, a lot of learnings, a lot of realizations, a lot of new pilots, like how should we do something. So I like your pilot, adding this as a 4-pillar beyond the process, people and technology. Funny enough, even when I was writing my book, I used a lot of this kind of 3-pillar principle to kind of break across the data. But now, when I'm thinking this through, okay, so you come to this realization, you condense that into the book. So you have a perfect IP, which feels very, very relevant as well. How do you get to read this to the people whom it's really important? Like, if we're talking about the C-level, and also beyond even the data professionals, but the C-level who really should see it as something very different. How do you get them to read this?
You are hitting a very important point, Aleksejs, and that's also, to be very transparent, that's been one of the journeys we've been on since the launch of the book. We've got a lot of good feedback, but especially when we've had the C-suite, we've had a couple of CEOs read our book as well, and they found it very nice, but they also found it very dense, to be very transparent. So there's been a couple of feedback saying, hey, could there be a handbook, for example, for a CEO, which is a great idea. But you can't do a handbook till you come out with the book itself, because then you don't have the credibility to just say, hey, this is a book for the CEO. So we first wanted to get the book out with all of our frameworks and concepts in mind, which I still feel will be readable for a C-suite. So it's not a jargon-filled, so there is no huge acronyms or technology-filled book. They're absolutely more principle-oriented, business-oriented. So C-suite will still be able to digest it, but especially in the world we live today, I think that like we are doing today, perhaps a podcast or perhaps a handbook or a bite-sized version could be also a way to reach more C-suite members. Because the ultimate goal is indeed to have the C-suite realize kind of the importance of this. Because I mean, I'll give you also a perspective which we heard from a recent C-suite member, which I think was a very good perspective. He kind of said most enterprises are on two sides of the coin with AI. One side of the coin is I have to get on board on AI ASAP because my competition uh, is on the same horse, and we are both running a race. So I have to be on the saddle and run. I may fall a few times, but I have to go on the saddle, right? Which is a great perspective. There's another side of the coin. We see the C-suite saying, let this whole innovation piece die down. There's AI is a bubble of sorts. A lot is happening. A lot of companies will come and go, and then we will see what is really remaining, especially with the regulation aspect, with the privacy aspect. So let me ride the AI wave. So both sides of the coin are existing, but he said one side of irrespective of which side of the coin you are from a C-suite, if you do not get your data right today, you will not be ready to pivot in either of these sides, right? Either if you're too much on the AI game and you want to be much more privacy sensitive, you still need data and semantics to ensure you're there. Or if you say no, I want to ensure I will be first privacy sensitive and I have all the guardrails in place, and then only I will start AI programs. Again, that data foundation is critical, right? So what he said is even if you do nothing from an AI perspective for the next 6 months to 1 year as a C-suite, you better get your data foundations in order, and not just from a pocket of the enterprise, from an overall enterprise standpoint. And I found that a very insightful discussion. Right. So these are the kind of things we want the C-suite to understand. But yeah, I'm cognizant that everyone will not perhaps pick up the book on its form as it is today to read it. Of course.
But how do you then still incentivize? So we talked about this incentivization for the data people. How you would incentivize, the senior leaders to even take this perspective, right? Because I'm capturing what you just said, right? And this was great perspective, but it's kind of a sound as fix your data foundation, right? And so you go to the data leader, to the senior business leader in a company, and you say, independently on how much you sit on your AI ambitions, you better fix the data, right? You need to have these foundations in a good shape. He says, okay, perfect, I got you, fix it.
No, that's actually
I don't need to read anything, just go and fix it, right? Talk to my data leader, get him this done.
Yeah. In a way, I mean, for a C-suite, it's not like we should not be going and saying, you're right, go and fix your data, and in which case we will be redirected again to the data teams or the IT teams, and we'll be again in a hole. So that goes back to the discussion we had, right? When we do the business value assessment. So for a C-suite, I would say, what is your 2-3 big initiatives for the next 2 years? Forget data at all. For example, they may say, I want to be the most sustainable enterprise, or I have these net zero goals by 2030. A lot of data leaders may say, hey, I want to make sure that I get a lot of revenue from services. I've been selling a lot of products, now I'm moved to also selling services. Or they may say, hey, I have this big new acquisition I'm planning, we are going to grow by acquiring a lot more companies. So this is my biggest goal. In all of these 3 goals examples I gave, that is where we need to then explain what would happen if you do not have data strategically in place. So more fit it into their day out agenda, and showing them either a carrot or a stick approach of what would happen if you do not have what we eventually it's if you do not have your data foundations, but again correlated to these. For example, if we take the sustainability example, we see a lot of our enterprises, and I'm sure you do as well, struggling, especially when we need to go to deeper level of analysis. When you need to go to scope 2 or scope 3 reporting, they find out, hey, we do not have a data foundation in order to also go into the details of understanding, for example, carbon footprint at a detailed level from each and every plant or each and every supplier that I have. So eventually, all of these strategic initiatives have a very important data foundation required. Finding what are those data requirements is, I think, where the role again of the data team with people like us to, of course, guide them comes in.
So you're kind of pointing on that pain point in the company, yeah? Or opportunity. So it's either the pain point or the opportunity.
Yes.
Yeah. So if we want to go, like as you say, deeper into sustainability, or we want to have aggressive GTM strategy, then you say, hey, you need the data. And to get the data right, you need to read this.
Correct. Yeah, and also perhaps this is where the I mean, one of the important things is for the team, whether it's us or it's the office team, they also need to be data driven when approaching the C-suite, right? I mean, this is a bit of a chicken and egg situation, of course. But for example, I'm again giving a very practical example. For example, the C-suite says we are going to open a new market in China. I'm just giving an example. We want to open a new plant in China, and that's my main objective. Now it's up to data leader to call out when you open a new plant. Last time, what were the numbers? What is the numbers going to improve as a result of doing whatever we are talking about, whether it's in terms of revenue, top line, bottom line, profitability, etc. But also bringing out that flavor of, hey, if you're going to open a new plant in China, we know these are all the data points you have to be specifically aware of China, right? For example, I'm making up as we go. For example, there are certain processes which are different based on Chinese regulation versus what you probably have done in Europe. There are different technologies you need to adopt because certain technologies are not perhaps permitted in China due to Chinese specific regulations. So when the data leaders come with this perspective beyond, just saying, oh, we need this data foundation, or we will need metadata, and I need X budget for you. Coming out with that data driven insight at the first layer itself when you're talking to the C suite, that is, I think, fundamentally important. And for that, of course, data leaders needs to be armed with data beyond what is just there today, right? And that requires also some help from the team to bring in external data, third party data, and AI, of course, can be an augmentation on top of this to become your assistant of sorts.
This is super interesting perspective. I was reflecting when you're talking through, and I realized that it's a super interesting trick. Like when the data leaders usually talk to the business, they say, hey, you have to get data driven, right? And I will help you, from the data perspective, because
Yes.
I'm kind of feeling as a supply for you from the data perspective. And what I'm hearing in what you're just saying is that actually it's a bit creditable in those conversations. You have to be, as a data leader, you have to kind of know that data yourself, like you are the business leader, right? So before you're pushing to somebody like, hey, you have to get that data and use it everywhere, I think it's a very legitimate question, but do you, as a data leader, understand actually what company is doing and what kind of data you're bringing in, and how it helps to drive the company's success, right? And so, which pushes data leaders a lot into that learning of the business, and it's again kind of doubles down of what we discussed in the beginning, that the data leaders today really have to be in this business view, in this business conversation, and very close to what happens in the business to find not only the relevance, but even this leverage, to use that data as a leverage of achieving those, business and data goals.
Absolutely. And I'll give you one more example, which I think fits in this discussion. During the writing of the book, we managed to work with such great data and business leaders. And one of them was, as I said before, the CDO of Audi production, 𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗏. And this is written in the book, so I can call out what he said. First thing is, Rudiger is coming from a mechanical engineering background, so he knows how it is to work with automotive and parts and so on. So he's really comes from a business background. And secondly, he has been to many shop floors himself, right? So a lot of data leaders may say, "Oh, I know the process. I've read it in a document," but there is nothing like being talking on the grounds to the people. What are their problems? Right? And he mentioned an example of how a data leader steps in. So for example, in the shop floor at Audi, they are doing a lot of welding, and a lot of the recalls were happening later in the shop floor because the weld was not done properly. Imagine, in a car, you have, I'm sure, thousands and millions of welds you need to do of particular parts, and the frame, and all of this going through. Even if one of this is not correct, when they do, let's say, a paint job later on, they have to find out, hey, the weld is not correct. They send it back, right? They have to go back and re-weld this whole thing. So this is a business pain point. And for instance, they found out that the AI could be a good, everyone is looking at AI. They thought, okay, let's use AI to solve this problem. They started taking pictures of the welds and started identifying using a machine learning model which are the situations the recall is happening, and then train this model to identify this from for new welds that is coming in. But Rudiger and data team find out picture is one data point. Picture is in essence, picture is also data because it's kind of unstructured images, which is helping the model to be trained. They found out another data point should be temperature. So depending on the temperature when they are welding, if that is uh, you know, too high or too low, that can also impact the weld quality. So capturing temperature is also improving perhaps the accuracy of finding out weld went wrong or right, and the helps then better predict that something is going to be a wrong weld at the time itself. Now this is an example which probably you at least I wouldn't have found this out myself if I was just a data leader at such a company, unless I am doing what Rudiger has done by being in the shop floors and so on. So that is the kind of insights that also brings trust in the business team. Imagine now next time if Rudiger goes to this team and says, hey, these are the other things you need, they look at him as a trusted advisor, not just from a data perspective, but also to help improve the business problems they have. That is the kind of, I think, leaders we need from a data perspective.
I totally agree with you. This was my learning as well. When I had this position as a data leader at Microsoft, I had to learn all these different businesses, these business lines of the company, and how we do it. And I really encouraging since then, every data leader we are speaking with, I'm encouraging like, hey, go and learn deep, like what is the company is doing, because you will not only expand your knowledge phenomenally and you will get more recognition and respect, from your business peers, but you also see those kind of real life situations where, something needs to be changed, something is dependent on the data. And maybe people, they kind of not realizing this, because you have this unique data perspective, but it's not enough to be successful with just unique until you bring it, into that common other perspectives of the business. Yeah. And then it starts to play strong because you're adding to the views of the people and their knowledge.
Exactly. And I think that is the difference between just supplying data and activating data, right? Supplying data is, I think, also important. I'm not undermining the importance of that. A lot of places supply can also go wrong where you have massive data quality challenges, or there are performance challenges, infrastructure challenges. So I'm not undermining the role of that. But I think especially with the maturity we are in today, the activation is kind of the differentiation factor, right? Because that will drive, I think, supply by itself, and the investments will take care of itself than just look at from a supply.
Sid, I have an important question to you. So what I've seen in the recent past, and this very much confirms what you just said, what I've seen is that the most successful data leaders, they came from the business.
Mhm.
They're from different business segments, from marketing, from commercial steering, from, domain leadership, but they basically came from that business side, and then they kind of took data, as additional knowledge, as additional expertise, the additional priority. Thinking this way, what do you see as a future of the data leadership roles?
Yeah, you bring an important point. One thing we've not talked about, of course, a little bit, is what is the journey of that company itself from a data perspective, right? So, what kind of data leader is required could also depend on where the enterprise is, right? And it could become a mismatch of sorts. Just to give an example, of course, you require, whether you come from the business side or the IT side, I think you need to know the other side very well. On either you learn it very quickly on the job, or ideally you've worked at similar enterprises, and you know at least the concepts of it, and you learn the nuances of that particular enterprise on the job. But I think within this layer as well, there is a layer of data leadership. Just like any leaders, some data leaders are very good at evangelizing with business leaders, C-suite, motivating the company, and certain data leaders are much better at operational excellence. Now it depends a little bit again on this kind of demand supply side of this coin, where you are today. That's also why we build that maturity framework where you can measure where you are today in both axes, demand and supply, and also where your ambition is from an enterprise perspective. So I wouldn't say one size fits all, Alexis, but for sure, even if you come from a technology background, I think this is the time to make sure you are building up your business skills and industry skills, and you could still be very successful. But I would say to your original question, it's much easier coming from the business side to learn the data and the technology side of things than the other way around, coming from the data and technology side, learning the business side.
Good, but how do you see this then in the future? Yeah, so let me give it two extremes, right? Again, the opinions which I hear, across the different boards. So the one side says, well, data is such a horizontal flow, and it's such a specific thing, and it's ever changing, and so on. We have more regulations, more accountabilities, more power to AI. So we definitely need that role of the CDO, let's say, to be elevated, similar to like we have a CFO. So there's somebody who is responsible for entire result out of data. So not just, let me give some engineering effort or analytics or ingestion or whatsoever, but to truly be on the pair with other data leaders, other business leaders, and, really represent like this entire end-to-end impact of data. So this is the one perspective. The other perspective says, that's whole bullshit. Because, data only works within the business context. And so, as we say, great data leaders usually come from the business. So if the business leaders kind of step into this space more actively, they become like really good with this data, notion and how to use it and how to use AI, within their business capabilities, then we don't need any kind of a, CDO or CDIO or whatever type of role, because eventually they will just use this, as you say, as a fourth pillar of their own business organization, and then we'll use it, the way we need it, hiring necessary talent or investing into certain technologies and so on. It's just part of the business, yeah? So it's not anymore like a thing in itself, but it's a part of the business. So which perspective is closer to you?
Depends. I mean, like most questions, this one depends as well. But let me explain what I mean by that. Let's take two scenarios, like you said, and what could be a good model for that. And the same company may enter the same scenario over time, right? So, for example, if business leaders do see data and see the demand and understand this, there could still be a role of a central data team like a CFO to ensure that demand meets supply, to ensure that there's reusability, that ensure that there's common thread of processes from a data standpoint, so that you are able to maximize this demand. Because if indeed, as you were saying, the business is seeing so much demand and every business function has that knowledge of data and understanding it as a fourth pillar, then the demand should be tremendous, and that is a real role then required from a central perspective to ensure that demand can be met. Then there is that scenario. If that is not the case, then the central team also becomes a maturity augmenter. So then this function also becomes initially an augmentation function to the different business units to ensure. And when we say augment, it's not just from a tech standpoint, like everything we've been discussing. It's augmenting the best ways to think about data. It's augmenting how to adopt, how to measure adoption. All of this needs to come from this central function. And perhaps over time, this central function becomes leaner, right? And then the business starts doing a lot of this themselves. But I would say this again depends, as I said before, on the maturity.
So the maturity basically defines everything, but as the maturity increases, we're likely to see it more embedded, so we will see data more embedded into the things versus, being separated.
Correct. If the maturity is high, in other words, the operating model of the enterprise, irrespective of data, is the same as the operating model for data. So if an enterprise operates federated or decentralized, data also operates the same way. If an enterprise is a small, medium enterprise operates centrally, of course, data can also operate that central function.
Great. Question. What would you do as a best advice to a data leader, besides reading your book?
As said before, if you're a data leader, the first thing you should know is try to sit with the business different functions, not just the leaders, but the people in these business functions. So, how exactly that process works? What are their day in day out challenges? Just very similar, like if you're selling a product, you try to get to know your customers, right? What exactly are the pain points of the customer? For a data leader, that customer, the first line of customer is the different business units. So be kind of very savvy about your customers, which is your business units, and try to understand each and every detail that you can pick up before you start building a complex data strategy, or revamping your entire technology portfolio or things like that. I would say that is kind of the key message I'd like to give.
And if you're good on this already?
Quite a few of them are. Quite a few leaders are good at it, but then they of course need help to scale this out, and that is where the kind of team, to go back, you require a good team to complement this data leader. A data leader by itself or herself, just like any leader, is as good as the team they have. So having different skills, having different perspectives, also having a team, as we discussed before, which is data savvy, and they're not just talking the talk, but they're also collecting these data points so that the data leader can augment that with the business unit. That is, I think, important.
So we have a success formula, but they first need to learn really about their business, their customers, and like where the impact goes, and then they transfer their focus on the team capabilities, and then they foster that team, maturity and ability to support the business.
Correct. And then eventually be a very good storyteller, so that all those successes that you get needs to be relayed back, of course, with the right financial, with the right business value, etc. So you need to be also a very good storyteller. But that's, I would say, more a cherry on the top. If you're a great storyteller, but you do not have any of the previous things we discussed, you wouldn't have, or you will have to make up stories, which is also not the right thing to do, right? Ethically and morally. So, of course, yeah, you need to be a good storyteller, but that is, I would say, the cherry on this other pieces we discussed.
My super takeaway from today's interview is that when you as a data leader want to tell to the business, like, hey, you need to be data driven, I would say, you first take a mirror, look at this and say, you need to be data driven. And then if you feel really good about this, positive that yes, I am data driven, then you can actually go and talk to business about this.
Correct. Yes.
I love it. Okay, last question. So at the age of AI, writing a book, what is it? Is it like something old-fashioned? Does it still matter? You can create a book with GPT over the weekend. So how do you see it? Really, it's so much effort.
It is. Actually, we started writing the book more than 2 years ago, where, of course, AI started making the buzz, but it's not as moved to the agentic space as we went on. It is honestly a lot of effort, but I would say it's very still important, because even if you use the best AI model, or if you build some fancy agentic flow, uh, the unique perspective, because as we know, language models are trained based on, as in a very simplistic view, a language model is a next word predictor. And of course, that could help you in a few ways. I would say you should not completely reject it. So you could still use it to fact check some stuff. You could do it for research study. You could even use something like, a non-AI tool like Grammarly can also be very useful to edit. So some of these tools should be used for your aid, but that perspective and the thought that you bring in, as you know, that AI model has not sat like I have with so many customers and seen what are their pain points, right? So I think it will be very difficult for AI to write books like these. Again, I'm not completely ruling it out, but at least the way we stand today, as of December 2025, I still think there's a lot of value to writing a book. The other important piece is that writing a book is, of course, for your community, but also a journey for yourself as an author, right? So it's also having those conversations where you're not spending all your time just sitting in front of a pen or in front of a keyboard. You're actually spending an equal amount of time, if not more, meeting a lot of great people with whom you brainstorm, get a lot of perspectives in. So that kind of shapes who you are as well as a person, especially for a book like this. So I think though that is very much worth the effort in itself.
Yeah, I agree. I felt for my own experiences that it helped me to clarify a lot of my own thoughts and kind of put them in a more structured way. Yeah, so you always have them, but to have them in a structured way is a different level. And then the other thing I found also interesting is that when you're trying to share so much intensively of what you've been seeing or you've been experiencing, when you check it on the editing time and you get these feedbacks, from people like, but what is what you're trying to say here? I don't understand. So when you go for always editing, eventually I felt like you become a much better communicator at the end because you so many times clarified the stuff which you was using automatically for a while. And maybe people were not, giving you this precise feedback, but it's not clear enough or it's not crisp enough and so on.
Yep.
And when you go for this book exercise, you suddenly realize like, oh, actually, I need to tell it differently, So
Yeah, and also, I mean, it learns you a lot how to be thick-skinned, how to pivot very quickly. Because also when we were writing this book, I mean, if you see the title of the book, it also says an executive guide to scaling AI. And when we started the book, what scaling AI versus 1.5 years later when the book is about to be published, how to scale AI completely changed. So you're constantly also pivoting in this front, which is also a lot of learnings in that sense, right? Also I think very useful for soul searching in that.
super nice. Sid, it was super nice to have you. So as usual, time flies. So it was great conversation. Thank you for spending these moments with us and sharing, your experiences, your views, your practices, your wonderful book.
Absolutely. Thanks, Aleksejs. I mean, always been a pleasure. I've learned a lot whenever I've been part of Data Masterclass. It's been a lot of learning back for me as well, like the community event we've done. So I think I want to thank you as well, especially for this year and some of our great collaborations together. So appreciate it.
We'll see you soon of one of our events.
Absolutely. Looking forward.
Super. Thank you so much.
Data Masterclass, where great data journeys begin.